Grace and peace. I'm Brian Most of the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. And we are continuing our series, Heavy is the Crown, the Rise and Fall of the Hebrew Kingdom. This is the summer term Bible study. 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel are kind of our reference points. And we're at the third lesson, A House Divided, looking at how the kingdom of Israel and the northern 10 tribes separate from the kingdom of Judah after Solomon during the reign of Rehoboam. And we're looking at the reasons why this happens. Now, the text explicitly says it's God's judgment due to the idolatry that the Israelites commit under the reign of Solomon, that Solomon actually initiates and encourages them to do because of his foreign wives. And then the text also goes on to tell several narratives explaining the situation that are lesser reasons, secondary reasons. The text has the primary spiritual reason, but then also explains the narrative in a way that we see multiple other reasons. And we've talked about two of those reasons so far. David's brutality in war, how David's use of the military actually created rebels within the kingdom and the empire in Edom and in Damascus. And then also a change in Egyptian politics. The alliance with Pharaoh's daughter that was once a good thing now has become a bad thing. But we're going to look at two more internal ones, just with Solomon's use of forced labor. And it's important to understand that the primary identity, the central people-forming identity of Israel is that they were once slaves in Egypt, and God has freed them from slavery. That is their nation-forming narrative. That is who they identify as a people. You know, Judah and Ephraim might disagree a lot. The different tribes might have different things that they don't like about the other tribes. But the one thing that unites them is this idea that they were all slaves in Egypt, and God acted miraculously to free them all, which is important to understand in how we look at that. Being slaves freed from Egypt is a primary identity maker for the nation of Egypt. Deuteronomy 6 has the Shema in there, one of the central verses of the Jewish faith, and one of the key pieces to it at the end of chapter 6. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give our fathers. So in one of the central passages of the Torah, in this text that is creating the love Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and soul, heart, mind, and strength. In that passage, the explanation is, why is this? God freed us from slaves. Looking a little bit also in 17:20, in this passage about what the king will do. He's not to consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or the left. Then he and his descendants will reign over a long time over his kingdom. So the king shouldn't be better than the rest of the people. The people themselves are identified as free slaves. Let's look at and then also hear this idea in this First Samuel, the thing as Samuel's warning the Israelites about what the king will do. And you shall be his slaves is the ending of that passage. claim these rights, and you shall be his slaves. And that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. This phrase, cry out, shows up in Judges about how the Israelites cried out against their oppressors and God delivered them. It also is in Samuel, again, about oppressors and God delivered them. That 12:8 passage that is underlined is about how is Samuel in his last speech to the Israelites is describing their freedom from Egypt, and they cry out to God, and God delivers them from Egypt. This passage is saying in Samuel 8 that someday you will become slaves of your own appointed king, like you were slaves in Egypt. And you will cry out to God to free you from your own appointed king, like you cried out to God from Egypt. But God won't hear you. So it is directly comparing the rule of the king over the Israelites to the rule of the Pharaoh over the Israelites when they were slaves. It's seeing those two as overlapping, and we see this. Solomon uses forced labor. 1 Kings 5 describes Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. Now, there is a phrase there, conscripted laborers, and it goes into describing, and you can pause to read this, but they spend 1 month here and 2 months there, and they rotate, and 10,000 each month is going on there. It's conscripted laborers. And then we see this passage about how Solomon treated slave laborers from the non-Israelites living in the land, and then he had Israelites over top of them. So it does make a clarifying that Solomon only permanent enslaved the non-Israelite inhabitants of the land, but he conscripted and made them serve for 1 month out of 3 forced labor, conscripted labor, to do Solomon's building projects, but not slave labor. Now, if your identity is freed slaves from Egypt, and the king in any shape or form is starting to conscript labor, that's going to send up a red flag. That's going to hit you in a very sensitive spot that you're going to be like, whoa, wait a minute. This king is getting a little too close to what we want. And then Jeroboam is raised up. And also this passage, 1 Kings 11, has just described Hadad, the Edomite, who's leading a rebellion in Edom, and Rezon, the guy from Zobah, leading a rebellion in Damascus, and Jeroboam from within Ephraim, one of the tribes of an Israelite. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials. He was an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall in the city, and David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing. When Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of Joseph. So Jeroboam is actually an official in Solomon's court helping with labor, and he's in charge of, sounds like, the conscripted laborers of Israel that were coming out of Ephraim. So Solomon's use of forced labor actually creates the position that brings Jeroboam to prominence. And then looking a little bit farther, and look at this, the guy who Jeroboam rebels against Solomon and all this kind of stuff, and really, really brings it to head against Rehoboam. And when he leads the 10 tribes in rebellion against the southern tribe of Judah, when he actually separates them, he installs 2 calves to worship in relationship to how Aaron connected the calves to that idea of wandering through the desert. But listen to this language. After seeking advice, the king, King Jeroboam, made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." He set up in Bethel. He set up in Bethel and the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Now, so Bethel and Dan, southern Israel, northern Israel. Bethel's real close to Judah, just across the border. But did you pick that up? Jeroboam makes 2 calves like the one Aaron made while they were wandering through the desert. Moses is up on getting the 10 commandments. Aaron makes a calf. The Israelites worship. This is who brought you up out of Egypt. Jeroboam makes 2 calves like that. Jeroboam is comparing being delivered from Solomon to what the Israelites experienced being delivered from Pharaoh. Jeroboam is using a religious experience that was founded on deliverance from slavery in Egypt and setting that same religious experience, although it's idolatry, although it is wrong, he is referencing that deliverance from Egypt and the calf that he creates is pointing back to the calf that they said delivered them from Egypt. Jeroboam is successfully creating a rebellion because he's comparing Solomon and the forced labor that Solomon used, Solomon's heavy-handedness, to Pharaoh's slavery. That's what's going on here. That's kind of the unpacking of things. So, also, and this is a thing that we haven't looked at as well. Solomon provided peace. When Israel was calling out for a king, they wanted a king because they were being threatened. Have a king fight our battles. Solomon provided peace, so there was no threat anymore. And it's hard to give the king his rights in exchange for being delivered from a threat, for a threat you don't feel anymore. Also, Israel's identity was being freed slaves. Solomon's forced labor contradicts that identity greatly. So, do we ever seek God's help for an immediate need, but then forget about God once that need is met? So, some questions to discuss and think about along those lines as Solomon's forced labor. And then Rehoboam's just an idiot. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, and as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, "My fathers made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word of the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. Looking at it, verse 18, King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get in his chariot and escape to Jerusalem, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So Rehoboam says, "Oh, okay, so you're upset with Solomon's forced labor because it hits your identity, all this kind of stuff." He's not thinking that, but you're upset. I'm going to make it worse. What right do you have? So Israel rebels, and who does Rehoboam send? Adoniram, who's in charge of forced labor. So Rehoboam is relating to his country and the people of his country as if they were his workforce. He sends the guy in charge of the workforce. Doesn't send the army, doesn't send a politician. He's like, you're not rebellious people, you're rebellious servants. Here's the guy in charge of my servants. You rebellious servants, I'm going to send him, who's in charge of forced labor, to deal with you because that's how I relate to you. You are not my people, you are my servants. Rehoboam's just foolish, and the way Rehoboam reacts to the request of the people doubles down on the idea that the king only saw them as servants and slaves. And obviously, Israel rebels from that. So we see Solomon's use of forced labor and Rehoboam's not understanding, like almost entitlement. He's no longer in a bargain with the people. The people are his servants, not they're serving him so that he provides perfection. They serve him because that's who they are. Rehoboam is an idiot as he applies that to things. So as we're looking at this, these are the 5 different. Israel's idolatry caused God to divide the kingdom. But as underlying causes, David's brutality created foreign enemies. A change in Egyptian politics removed critical allies. Solomon's use of forced labor created enemies inside the nation of Israel. Rehoboam's stupidity caused other issues to come. All these other issues to come to be acted on. So these 4 things are the way God's judgment for their idolatry was acted out. So looking at this, if you can explain events with purely physical, emotional, or social causes, does that remove the possibility of spiritual causes? Why or why not? What are some current things on a personal scale that might have both earthly and spiritual causes? How about on a global scale? We'd love to hear from you in these conversations. Drop down in the comments section to share them. I would be very interested in hearing some discussion on these ideas. Hopefully this was a good conversation about the division of the kingdom. There are 2 ways to join this conversation: in person Sunday nights, 5 p.m. in the JEMIC, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media. Like, subscribe, and follow as you see fit on TikTok, YouTube, WordPress, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all those sorts of things. Find me there and, like, subscribe, follow as appropriate. Direct message me if you want to contact me. I enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully it continues real soon.